My name is Dr. Marian Diaz. For those of you who don't know who I am the Director of Thriving in Ministry at Catholic Theological Union. And I am the Director of Continuing Education, as well as all of our summer program. And I just briefly want to mention my co-host here today, Dr. Chrissy Zaker. Chrissy, do you want to just quick say hi?
Hello, everyone. Good to see you.
Great. And so just to give you a little context of what brought us to the point of sponsoring these webinars with Springtide Research Institute. Chrissy and I have been working for a few years on a small grant that was called Support and Synergy for Youth and Young Adult Ministers. And so this was an amount of funding that we had to use to work with professionals in ministry and Catholic ministry who are working with youth and young adults in a variety of the forms of ministry that they were engaging in. And so as COVID was hitting, and I have been aware of the research of Springtide for some time, wanted to just work with them and have them engage with us. And so what you'll be seeing from us is this two-part series. And in this first lecture, we'll kind of be breaking out their general research. And then actually we're able to help support them to get funding to break out some Catholic data on youth and young adults. And that will be the focus of the March 12th series. So today, what we'll be doing, Christy will lead us in prayer, and then I'll introduce Josh, and he'll be presenting for us. And then we'll have about 15 minutes or so of discussion, which will be moderated through the chat by Chrissy. And then we'll take a short break at about an hour in. And then we'd really invite you to stick around, come back, and we'll be doing small groups to help you kind of integrate the content into your ministry. We really, as coming out of this grant, we really want not only to provide people with great content, but we want you to all be networking with each other and helping, support this content really have impact in your ministry. You don't have a lot of places where you can network right now during COVID potentially. And so that's a really important piece for us. And we encourage you to stick around. For those of you who are new to CTU and have not connected with us before, we are a School of Theology and Ministry in Hyde Park, Chicago. And we are formed and supported by religious men's communities. We've been around for 50 years and have also always supported the theological and ministerial education of women and lay persons and women religious as well. So we'll put up a link to some of our websites and potentially if you know of someone who is interested maybe in further studies, you could have them text our enrollment management people as well. So again, welcome. And with that, Christy will lead us in prayer.
All right, let me pull it up here. Well, welcome everybody. Let me add my own welcome. I am the Director of Field Education at CTU, as well as teach in the Spirituality and Pastoral Ministry Department, and am grateful for your presence here today and hope that today is a time of retreat and renewal, and you have feel some support from CTU as well as some synergy from your colleagues here in the room with us. So take a deep breath, bring yourself here to this space where we are together. Eternal friend, God of all belonging, we come to you today mindful of the young people we serve, mindful of their hunger to belong, their longing to be supported, their hopes and fears that drive their actions in the world. May you shape us to be servants willing to share your good news, companions steadfastly supporting and nourishing the dreams they hold, mentors and wisdom figures who stumble ourselves, yet demonstrate how to get up and keep moving closer to you. Today, give us a moment to breathe deeply, to pause, invite us to learn from one another, and to feel your invitation at the core of our time together. In this pause, may we hear what Jesus spoke in today's gospel, Epaphatha. May our eyes and ears be opened to your healing embrace. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you. Just another quick little welcome to all those who are still coming in. And I'm really, really excited to introduce Dr. Joshua Packard. I really feel that these topics that we're addressing in this series is the topic, one of the most important topics for the Catholic Church in our society and religion in general moving forward. So Dr. Joshua Packard is the Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute. He is an accomplished researcher, speaker, and academic in the field of sociology and for new forms of religious expression. He has written numerous articles, given dozens of speeches about religion in America. He is also the author with Ashley Hope of Church Refugees. Sociologists reveal why people are done with church, but not their faith. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Josh. Thanks for being here with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited for this. It's great to see so many people coming out on a Friday. I guess it's a weird thing to say, coming out. We're all just sitting on Zoom, but joining us. How about that? How about joining us on a Friday morning? I see some true gluttons for punishment because I recognize some familiar names who have seen presentations of mine before. So I'm glad to see some people coming back, and I think these are great community discussions. So what we'll do today is, as Marian said, I'll talk for a little bit and sort of lay out sort of our approach at Springtide and where we see the religious landscape, what informs our work, and then sort of like give some big picture overview stuff, and then hopefully have some time here to get into some of the sort of prescriptive elements so you can see how Springtide approaches this new religious landscape from a prescriptive stance, but really then to leave the conversation at that point so that we can do the really fruitful work, which is to be answering questions, talking amongst ourselves, doing that really important networking stuff. I know that the sense of community, which we're going to talk a lot about today, that we all miss even in our own lives. So feel free as I'm talking, if you want to drop questions into the chat here, we will certainly have time to get to those. And yeah, I think that's about as much as I need to say in terms of preamble. So let me see if I can get the right screen to share. All right, how does that look? Do you all see like a slide that has a title on it?
Yes.
That's great. We're off to a roaring start. The new landscape of American religion: belonging precedes believing. In some ways, this is going to be about what's new, but there's nothing new under the sun. Isn't that that's a scripture, right? That's a verse. And in many cases, this point that I'm going to be making today, that belonging comes before believing, is not actually new. It's just something that we tend to lose sight of every once in a while. So let me start with just a little bit of an overview about Springtide and who we are and what we're doing. At Springtide, we believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. That's our central mission. And so this research that we do, this actionable research that we conduct, is it's not, I think it's informative potentially to academics, but it's not super intended for academics to engage with on an intellectual only basis. We're really trying to bring really good research to people who are working in the lives of young people on a daily basis. Now, that being said, we're doing this from a position that is sociologically informed. That's my background and training. And I think that's a lot of what's missing from the general discussion about religion in America, and especially when it comes to young people. And I think you'll get a chance to see, hopefully, exactly why we feel that way. All of this sums up for us into this approach at Springtide that we call data with heart. So we're spending a lot of time, a lot of resources surveying, doing interviews and talking with young people, but also listening to them and listening to the people who are working with young people. And those things inform our work as much as anything else. So we're really, doing this scientifically rigorous data collection, but doing so in a way that is really embedded and grounded and contextualized. What this means for us is that, as opposed to maybe some other research institutes, which are either totally global or national in scale and have no ability to make any sort of like, what should you do with this information? Think like Pew and Gallup, who do really good work, but it's not super actionable. Or on the other side of that spectrum, you have research institutes that are maybe looking at the religious landscape and young people through the lens of a very narrow congregational based lens. We take a wholly different approach, and our commitment is just to go where young people are trying to make meaning in their lives. We find out what those conversations look like, who's with them, how they're sort of trying to navigate those waters in that landscape, and then we try and bring that information back. That takes us to some weird places sometimes. Sometimes that's in congregations, but of course, as you all know, increasingly that's not where young people are turning to find how to navigate their difficult questions, how to make sense of their life, and do those things. So we don't just limit ourselves to those either. We spend a lot of time with folks who have never set foot in a congregation at all. So all that is what informs our approach and our work. But this is also, today's talk is not just about Springtide's research, but it's sort of like, where are we at in America with regard to religion? So let's start off there, shall we? These first slides are going to be not Pew's work, but they're going to come from not Springtide's work, but they're going to come from Pew and Gallup and General Social Survey and National Studies. So here's a question that's been that survey companies, pollsters have been asking for a long time. How important would you say religion is in your own life? The data here I just picked 1993 so we could see some of the trends that maybe would encompass sort of the adult lives of people who would be here. And you see on that green, the top bar is very important. The blue is fairly important. Not very important is yellow. And then apparently there are some people who have no opinion about religion at all, which seems always striking to me. And what we end up with is this sort of like, yeah, okay, so we've got definitely, it looks like the green line has gone from like 59% there to 51, 52%, and certainly an uptick in the yellow for not very important. But I think this at least is a little bit counter to maybe some of the doom and gloom scenarios that we keep hearing about, where it sort of feels like there's this inexorable slide in the country towards, away from religion. We just don't, I don't know, like there's a decline for sure, but it's not this like falling off of a cliff into secularism that I think we often can get the picture of. Let's take a look at another piece of data here coming from, in this case, coming from Gallup. Do you believe in God? So in 1944 rather, 96% of the country believed in God. In 2017, a definite decline after a peak at 98 down to 87%, but still 87% of the country is like roughly on your side, right? They are generally open to a conversation about God. And again, we find the two people with no opinion about God, which strikes me as strange. And so as we try to account for this, I think it's important to understand then, like, why are we getting this narrative about sort of this march towards secularism if we still have relatively high rates of belief? People still say religion is important to them. And one of the keys for that, for understanding that, is really understanding the amount of diversity that's present in the United States, in particular, relative to lots of other countries. So I'm going to show you a chart now that I don't expect you to be able to make sense of right away. Don't worry, I'll explain it to you. On the vertical axis there, what we've got is the percentage of people who pray daily. The percentage of people in a country that pray daily, from 0 to 100. Along the bottom, then on the horizontal axis, what we've got is GDP per capita. And you see a pretty clear trend line. Wealthier countries have fewer people who pray daily, with one distinct outlier. I've highlighted that outlier here. It's the United States. Of the 102 countries in the study, the U.S. is the only one with both above average GDP per capita and above average frequency of daily prayer. Our GDP levels suggest that we should pray more on the rates of Sweden, Switzerland, Ireland, but our prayer rate suggests that our GDP should be something more in line with Bangladesh, Bolivia, South Africa. What's going on here is that there's not, more so than maybe any other country on this list, there's not just one America. There's not just one United States, rather. There's lots of different pockets of things going on inside the United States. So it's important that when we think about these trends, that we recognize that these need to be contextualized for cultural diversity. They need to be contextualized for generational diversity, for people coming in as immigrants and adding to the rich diversity of this country. All of them bringing with them, different cultures and habits and trend lines. So it's important to keep that in mind as you think about how to translate these numbers over to your own local context. I want to share with you just a couple of more big overview type numbers. And this is one that you've probably seen. This is the nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S, we're in Catholic context, so we need to specify, not N-U-N-S. The rise of the nuns that has been going on now for some time, and especially has gotten a lot of media attention in the last 10 or 15 years. These numbers, from whether you take them from Pew or Gallup, or in this case, the General Social Survey, which is done every 2 years, we see somewhat slightly varying rates, but we see the same trend lines. It's certainly the case that we've got an increasing number of people expressing no affiliation with any religious tradition. So the way we get this number, in case you're not familiar, is by, on these surveys, when we ask questions, which of the following do you identify with? And it's like Catholic, I'm sorry, Christian Catholic, Christian Protestant, or Buddhist would come first alphabetically, Muslim, etc., all the way down the list. And the very last bubble is none of these. And so people who click none, check none, that's where we get this number. And you see the age breakdown here. So not only is the trend line going up, but generationally, we see an acceleration among younger groups. At Springtide, all of our work that we do, we go all the way down to 13 years old. Instead of stopping at 18, we think it's really critical that we get down to when those rites of passage are happening, and when young teenagers are starting to make some of their first decisions about their own identities in real sort of concrete. I wouldn't say permanent. Nothing in the life of a 14-year-old is really permanent in most cases, but some real serious decisions. So when we look at that from our own data, we see that this number for 13 to 25-year-olds specifically is up to 39%. So this is this trend away from affiliation. Hear me clearly, away from affiliation, not away from belief, not away from religion necessarily, but away from affiliation, is not going to slow down anytime soon. And I think that's a critical distinction. And we're going to talk more about that and why this notion of affiliation is really important to keep in mind here. Because it both is the story and it is not the story. Just in case you're wondering, like, sort of how everybody else is doing outside of the context, outside of your particular context or any one context, we can look at these numbers and we see that what we've got here is the unaffiliated are growing like crazy relative to other groups. Christians are losing the most number of people, but I mean, come on, like that's what Christians are the largest group in the country, so it's only natural that their raw numbers of people switching out would be the most as well. There's simply more opportunity, quote unquote, for people to leave because so much more of the country identifies that way. But nevertheless, a large part of the net change of people leaving, expressing unaffiliated, is people leaving Christianity. The math here is, I think, pretty clear, just looking from this one chart. But I think that the focus on this, and this is where, I mean, I get it, like this is where people get really caught up is, how can we get them back? Why are people leaving? And I think that largely when it comes to young people, this is the wrong conversation to be having. That what we're seeing, as much as this is sort of like I don't know, in business sense, if you've ever worked in the for-profit world, this is what we would call a trailing indicator. This is not the problem to be fixed. This is the end result of some other things that are underlying that sort of result in this. And in fact, increasingly what we're seeing is not young people leaving, it's just young people never having been raised in the church at all, of any kind. I've seen this in my own career. The first time I taught sociology of religion as a graduate student, I would take students on field trips. We go to a mosque, we go to a temple, and we go to a Christian congregation, sometimes two, Catholic and Protestant. And most of my students had been in a house of worship before. And flash forward to like last year when I taught social religion for the last time, the vast majority of my students had never been in any of those places. Not been in a synagogue. They'd never been in a Christian church, and like it was their first time in every single one of those. So we're seeing this landscape shift right before our eyes, and I think it's the anxiety that causes by watching the numbers decline puts our attention in the wrong place. Even though it's understandable, I think it's a bit misguided. So what should we be paying attention to? Well, I think we've got one pretty distinct premise that comes out of some of our early research at Springtide, which starts with this notion: young people are lonely, isolated, and distrustful. And this is a somewhat counter narrative that what you might think if you don't spend a whole lot of time around young people, because it seems like they're hyper connected, and they are on their devices. But that doesn't always result in the kinds of relationships that they're looking for, and frankly, that young people need, even if they don't know it or can't express it at the younger ages, especially. Let me explain what I'm talking about here. So what we've got here is trust in the 1970s versus trust today in a variety of different institutions, as reported by Gallup and tracked over time. I've been a professor for a long time, so the quiz question here is, what trend do you notice? And if you are having trouble with that, I made a giant arrow to help you. Every single one of them is decreasing. So even though I get that, like, the place where your eyes probably naturally go is in the bottom there to organized religion, it's important, like that, from a sociological standpoint, that's only part of this story. And that's what I mean by focusing on these disaffiliation trends as being important, but not the whole story. It's a symptom of this larger thing, which is this move away from identifying with social institutions and trusting them in general, right? So this is for everybody, 18 all the way up. When we look at this from Springtide, of just trust among young people, then what we see is a very similar story. So this is just 13 to 25-year-olds. We see organized religion there at 4.8 right in the middle, but nobody's really getting that great of a score because this is a 10-point scale. So even nonprofits there at the top are getting a 5.3 out of 10. That's the story that is sort of encompassing these religious trends. And it's absolutely critical that we understand that. So here's why. If this was just a religious story, like if we looked at those trust levels and it's like everybody else is doing really well, religion's doing low, and there's all this disaffiliation, then we've got a different problem on our hands. We've got a religious problem. We've got a religious org problem that we need to fix by being better. But this isn't a religious problem. This is a societal shift that has occurred in the last 3, 4, 5 decades. That means that, like, you don't need to be better. You need to be different because the world is different. Y'all are good enough. Like, we don't see any evidence in the research that suggests that people are leaving in droves because of a particular thing. Like, Protestants didn't leave in droves in the 80s because of the televangelist scandals. Like, even despite the troubles that the Catholic Church has had, which have been significant and have certainly not helped with regards to sex abuse, like that's not going to be that is not the thing that is driving these trends wholesale. It's been a turn away from and a mistrust in institutions all across the board. And this becomes a part of the story that young people are now experiencing as they sort of are untethered. And this is absolutely critical. The reason it's critical is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, belonging precedes believing. Every once in a while, it seems like we sort of get this backwards. And certainly we make short-term gains by putting believing before belonging, and it feels like we're sort of making progress there. But if we don't address somebody's sense of belonging first, we'll never have a long-term impact, influence, commitment that can weather storms like a pandemic or a job change or going to college that we really want to have in the life of a young person. Now, I'm not just making this up because it sounds kind of cool. Belonging precedes believing. This is actually the very first sociological study that was ever done by a guy named Emil Durkheim out of France. And it's been borne out over the last century, time and time again, that if what we really want is people to make a commitment to a group, we have to get a sense of belonging before we start getting them to, like, agree to some statement of faith or to some democratic ideals if what you're trying to do is get them to belong to a country, or some mission statement if you're trying to get them to belong to a company. Belonging to a group is what lays the foundation for long-term belief. That's why this is so critical. And right now, we are in the middle of a belonging crisis. That's where the country is, hands down. Trust levels are just one thing. I want to show you this other study from Cigna that got us super interested in pursuing this at Springtide. Cigna is this big health conglomerate. They wanted to, they were doing this research a few years ago because they understand the health implications of social isolation. It's like the equivalent of smoking, I think, 16 cigarettes a day. Severe isolation has the same health consequences as smoking 16 cigarettes a day, if I remember correctly. Nearly half of Americans report sometimes or always feeling alone. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel as if there are people who understand them. And critically, for the work that we're talking about here, Gen Z, the youngest generation, is the loneliest generation. That's never happened before. This is using a standard scale from UCLA called loneliness scale or index. And as long as we've been tracking this, it's always, as you would imagine, the older generations that express the most loneliness and the most isolation. It's never before been the youngest generation in our country. And on top of that, their objective rates are higher than any that have ever been measured before. It is a belonging crisis that we have as people are untethering themselves from these social institutions that they don't have automatic trust for. So we can connect these dots pretty clearly. If we look at this like, okay, fine, that's national. What does this look like in the life of a young person? Well, we find that 66% of 13 to 25-year-olds have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a daily basis. So something like 2/3 have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a typical day. So we ask them in the survey and in interviews, the survey question is worded, we say, how many meaningful interactions do you have on a daily basis? And a meaningful interaction is something other than just talking about the weather or telling somebody that you're fine. So we've enough guidance there, hopefully, but not completely leaving it wide open. Over 30% of young people say that nobody, 0 people knows them well. And Megan put this to us pretty starkly in her interview with us. She's 24. She says, nobody cares. Nobody is really listening. This is certainly, I think it's hard because sometimes for adults who care to hear these messages, because you hear things like this and you're like, but I care and I'm listening. And I think that that's true. I don't doubt that at all. But it's important to understand that this is the experience of being 13 to 25 years old in this country right now, is that they feel this way. And that is certainly an accurate description of their feelings. Varun Soni, who's the Dean of Religious Life at USC, wrote an op-ed in the LA Times a few years ago. He, I think, summed this up so eloquently. He said, whereas students used to ask, how should I live? They are now more likely to ask, why should I live? Where they used to talk about hope and meaning, now they grapple with hopelessness and meaninglessness. I never got the question in my first 5 years at USC that I now get almost daily from students. How do I make friends? That's astonishing, right? He's on a college campus and how do I make friends? Students may have thousands of friends online, but few in real life. They may be experts at talking with their thumbs, but not so much with their tongues. And as a result, many feel as though they don't have a tribe or a sense of belonging. They feel disconnected from what it means to be human. Disconnected from what it means to be human because they don't have a sense of belonging. I think the really critical thing that we've been able to uncover here at Springtide, though, is that this is not all, this is bad news. This is alarming for sure, but it is not hopeless. Adults, the research that we do, and I say it's actionable, it's geared towards uncovering these solutions, not just sort of out here shouting about what the problems are. And what we found and what young people told us is consistently, last year, in the last year and a half, we've done 15,000 surveys, 200 interviews with young people. And consistently, this comes through about how important trusted adults are in their lives. In fact, the presence of just one adult relationship in the life of a young person, just one, can cut the effects of severe isolation in half. In half. Alex told us, the reason I stayed at my church is because of the sermons that my priest gave and the liturgy. Nope, Alex didn't say that. And in fact, no young person has ever said those words to us. When they say these kinds of things to us, what they say is, I stayed because of my mentor. She's very hospitable, very loving, very forgiving, non-judgmental, and has been so gracious. So even though adults are important, I think it's really critical that our research digs further, and not just to say like, adults are the antidote, adults just show up and do adult things, but we can drill down and be a little bit more specific, because this is critical, because it's not that like adults in the lives of a young person are not important in the ways that you might think. Let me explain more. So nearly 2/3 of the young people in our initial sample were attending their place of worship once a week or more, but there is no difference on how completely alone that they feel. 20% of young people, 1/5, who attend a religious service at least once a week still feel completely alone. In fact, I want to show you this thing, and there's no statistical difference in our sample at all in terms of people's levels of loneliness and their sense of belonging, their isolation rates, between whether they attend or whether they don't attend. So what you see in the light green bar here is the total sample, and in the dark green is those who attend religious gatherings. I have nobody to talk to. The difference is 39 to 36. I feel completely alone, 33 to 30. I feel as if no one understands me, is 45 to 43. In other words, attendance just doesn't have that impact, is not a good proxy for whether or not somebody has a sense of belonging, like it maybe once was. And I think it definitely once was. It's just not anymore, because just because we show up in a place, young people will tell us this all the time, just because I show up somewhere doesn't mean that that's my tribe. Just because I go to football practice every day after school doesn't mean I feel a sense of belonging to that team. Just because I attend worship services doesn't mean that I have a sense of belonging there. And so it doesn't necessarily automatically reduce their rates of loneliness. Mark told me, groups, organizations, and institutions have no effect on me as a person. I am who I am through experiences and those around me. Now, look, I don't think Mark's right. I mean, I'm a sociologist. I think groups and organizations do have an effect on him, but it's critical to understand that he absolutely feels this way. So that means that he's not going to go looking for groups and organizations and institutions when he has a problem or when he wants to make a change in his life. That is not the place that he's going to go. In fact, we kept asking young people for places, and they kept telling us about people. The places just don't matter like they once did. So here's what does matter. In red there, you've got the rates of different questions for young people who have 0 trusted adults in their lives. And in the orange or green there, you have if they have one or more, right? Just one. So rates of being completely alone go from 32 to 14. Stress levels drop by 15 percentage points. Confidence goes up by a dozen points just with the presence of one trusted adult. Summing it up just really like starkly, young people who have a relationship with a trusted adult in religious institutions are more trusting, less isolated, less stressed, more confident about their future, and more connected. That's what mattered. So attendance alone didn't matter, but attendance at a religious institution or service or an event where they also had a relationship there with a trusted adult, now we saw their rates of isolation and loneliness plummet. And all kinds of really good pro-social things like self-confidence coming back into the fold. And this is critically increasing their sense of belonging so we can open up those pathways to believing. So I know we're getting close here to the wrap up, but I want to share with you a few of these things that emerged from the research that are very explicit action-based items that I think we can start employing in our local context in a relatively immediate sort of sense, even during a pandemic. So the research was able to uncover, by talking with young people and looking at some of the other research around this issue about like, well, how can we create more belongingness? And we found that it's really a 3-step process: being noticed, named, and known. Or helping young people to feel noticed, named, and known. Let's take those just one at a time. So we saw this already. One adult matters. 31%, this is sort of heartbreaking, 31% of young people have one or fewer adults in their lives that they could trust, and 1 in 10 have 0. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily true, because I think that there are lots of adults who would care about a young person if they knew the young person needed caring for, but that is how young people feel. A young person who has a trusted adult in their life is far less lonely, but only if it's a personal relationship. 5 seems to be the magic number here. If we can get a young person connected to 5 adults, most of the research would sort of say like that's where we see benefits beyond 5, but that's where we really sort of tip the balance. and we can start fostering these kinds of relationships one at a time to create this sort of culture of being noticed and having conversations. We can do this in an individual way by how we communicate one-on-one with people, especially those at the margins, so we can sort of get this networked approach. But we can also do this in the way that we sort of symbolically convey the way that we notice people in terms of, especially when it comes to culture and heritage, that people, minority groups don't have to feel invisible. There's ways to do this systematically, institutionally, that are really important markers too. And so it's a combination. Noticing is not just one-on-one, although that's critical, but we can do this at an institutional level to make people feel more welcome as well. Unfortunately, this just isn't happening, even though it's more critical right now during the pandemic than ever. We did this research right in the first weeks of the stay-at-home orders, March of last year, and we're going to update it 1 year in. The survey's out in the field right now, and we'll be releasing it soon. This is the number of when we asked young people, like, okay, it's been a week, this is craziness. Like, if you remember, like, everything's shutting down, everybody's going home. Who's checking on you? And then the good news is that 75% of young people did have a trusted adult checking on them, usually family and friends. But then we see this other thing. Only 1% of them checked the box that clergy or faith leaders had checked in on them in these initial weeks when they really needed somebody to convey, and I think still do need someone to convey to them that they matter. So this is a way of, like, it's not just that there's no harm done by not noticing. I think there's an actual cost to not doing this kind of work. At the same time that this was happening, in the same survey, we had an overwhelming majority of young people tell us that they had started or picked up a new religious habit or practice since the stay-at-home orders had gone into effect. And so at the same time that you've got young people sort of like trying to make sense of this the best they can, we've got the experts in religious sense-making not doing this reaching out work to help guide them. And I think that's sort of symbolic of what we often see in young people's lives. This notion of noticing people not only matters with 1, but I said that 5 was that magic number, and I just wanted to show you some of that evidence here. So here are the rates for completely alone, no one understands me, feeling left out, feeling stressed. You can see the clear trend here from 0 to 1 to 2. By the time we get to 5, rates of being completely alone go down to 1 in 10. Even stress levels go from 73 to 39%. And it's not that adults are necessarily actively removing stress. It's that just knowing you have somebody you can count on is enough to reduce stress levels. Level 2, I am named. A community is the place where I am known by name and missed if I were gone, says Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. We need to start fostering meaningful interactions. This can be really hard to crack through, but I think this is about persistence, really. This is about staying after those conversations, asking the follow-up questions. The predominant experience of young people is of being dismissed and being invisible when it comes to adults. And so making that engagement, I mean, I've seen this with my own students over the years. I'll ask them some question that I'm genuinely interested in, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which is a fun question to ask a 19-year-old. And they'll give me some answer. It's not until I ask the second or third version of that question that they really sort of open up. They're just not used to adults caring about them. And so they have these sort of default or stock answers that are just sort of meant to move on. So naming them, like noticing them and then naming them by name, but also going deeper into those conversations because of the identity that comes along here is what we're really after. Chris says you'll have a deeper sense of belonging because people will know who you are. It's not just knowing people in the group, but people know you, which I think is such an insightful quote for a 19-year-old. Lastly, I am known. The known part is that the young person's presence starts to actually impact the shape of the group and what the group does, and that's how we get to this level of known, which is where full belonging happens. And we need to measure and track these things. Attendance is no longer a good enough benchmark to help us get a sense of what's going on in the lives of young people, how successful our youth program is. It's a measurement. It is a measurement that can be important, but it is not the days of just using that measurement to indicate what our impact is need to fall by the wayside because it's no longer a really good proxy. One last piece of advice here. James 24 says, when asked what belonging means, he says probably like a safe zone where someone feels safe to explore at their own pace and whatnot. And what we saw here is this notion from young people of really wanting you to be the expert, but they want to drive the timeline. So rather than this notion of like, we're going to go through this 8-week, Bible study class and you're going to come out the other end and you're going to know everything, like, just let them drive the timeline and be there as in the conversation with them for as long as they'll have you. The way Brenda sums this up, she says, I like when people are willing to experience new things with you or willing to step out of their comfort zone, like hand in hand. I think that's what really makes me feel comfortable because I don't feel so isolated or so afraid because I have someone else there with me. These are the relationships that will matter over the long haul. So it's that notice, name, known framework with some very clear steps and actionable things to do right along the way. But I think it's hard work. I don't mean to suggest that this is easy. It really is a series of one-on-one conversations and relationships, and you can't wait for them to come to you. As we've seen, they're not necessarily turning to institutions. We're going to have to find where young people are and then do this work of fostering belonging where young people are. I want to turn it over to questions now, but I'll make one last slide here. If you want to learn more about what we're doing at Springtide, you can come and find us at springtideresearch.org. We have this Turn the Tide newsletter, and if you come and sign up today, we'll pick 5 names and send 3 copies of the Belonging Report, which a lot of this research that I presented today comes out of. And it's a quick form. Promise we're not going to sell your information. It will help us to know who to ship it off to and get your address.